Chapter 12. Captain America and his team made their way back to London headquarters. Phillips had ordered them to bring the scientist Zola right to him. It was time to get answers. It didn't take long to break the Weasley man. He wanted to talk because all crazy people wanted to talk. Colonel Phillips brought him a good meal, which in his experience usually got people talking. Zola refused the steak because he was a vegetarian, so Phillips ate while he asked questions. Eventually they got down to business, when Phillips handed Zola an encrypted note he'd sent to Washington.
Given the valuable information he has provided, and in exchange for his full cooperation, Dr. Zola is being remanded to Switzerland?
Zola read. Of course it wasn't coded. You guys haven't broken those codes, have you? That would be awkward.
He will know this is a lie,
Zola said. He's going to kill you anyway, Doc. You're a liability. You know more about Schmidt than anyone, and the last guy you cost us was Captain Rogers' closest friend, so I wouldn't count on the very best of protection. It's you or Schmidt. He watched Zola process this and understand he had no other option than to give Phillips what he wanted.
Schmidt believes he walks in the footsteps of gods, Zola said. Only the entire world will satisfy him.
You do realize that's nuts, don't you?
Of course. The sanity of the plan is of no consequence.
And why is that?
Because he can do it,
Zola said. Phillips thought about this while he finished the steak. It was hard to get a good steak in these parts. He set down his knife and fork. Schmidt was nuts, that much they knew. But the entire world? What did Zola mean by that? Phillips needed some more specific answers. What's his target? The colonel asked.
Everywhere,
Zola said. He had a funny little smile on his face. After a few more hours of interrogation, Phillips had all the information he was going to get. He met with Peggy and ran through what he had learned. Then he called the others into the conference room. When everyone was settled, he began. Johann Schmidt belongs in the bug house, he said. He thinks he's a god, and he's going to blow up half the world to prove it. Peggy stood up and walked over to a map of the world, starting with the United States. The room grew silent as everyone processed the news. Peggy went on.
Schmidt's working with powers beyond our capabilities. He gets across the Atlantic. He'll wipe out the entire eastern seaboard in an hour.
As she spoke, she looked directly at Steve. Since he had returned from his latest mission, he had been withdrawn and quiet. They did not have the opportunity to talk about what had happened with Private Lorraine, and now it seemed they might never have the chance. A shiver of fear ran through her as she thought about what this latest intel meant for Steve. And for her. As Peggy spoke, everyone in the room turned and looked at the map, their eyes focusing on New York City. They were each thinking the same thing. The United States was completely defenseless against an attack of that magnitude. The majority of soldiers had been deployed to Europe or the Pacific. Schmidt was heading across the Atlantic. They had to act fast. How much time have we got? Dernier asked. Phillips looked grave. According to my new best friend, 24 hours. No one said anything for a moment. They had just returned from fighting Hydra and were tired, having been pushed to their limits. But they couldn't sit around and do nothing. Where is the Red Skull now? Steve asked, standing up. Hydra's last base is here, in the Alps, Phillips said, pointing to the map. Then he traced his finger down as he added, 500 feet below the surface. Steve nodded. This wasn't going to be easy, but they could do it. They had to do it. Looking at the rest of his team, he saw that they had the same determination in their eyes that he probably did. Captain America and the Howling Commandos were heading to the Alps. Chapter 13. Cap and his team worked quickly to prepare for their next, and hopefully last, mission. Stark outfitted them with equipment capable of taking out Hydra's defenses and of protecting them from enemy fire. While Steve gave the rest of the team a few hours off to relax and recharge, Peggy and Phillips briefed him on the layout of the base and the surrounding landscape. He would be taking the lead in the attack. The others would follow him once he was in, providing backup and, if necessary, an escape route. The part of the base that was above ground would be well guarded, but it would still be easy for Captain America to sneak in. The tricky part would be finding the Red Skull amid the labyrinthine corridors and rooms deep below the surface. The SSR didn't have specific information on where the Hydra leader would be holing up inside. Steve would be going in blind. But he wasn't worried. In fact, he had a plan that he hadn't shared with Peggy or Phillips. If everything went as he suspected it would, the Red Skull would come to him. Soon everything was in place. The team, including Peggy and Phillips, took a plane to a designated spot a few dozen miles from the base. Their hope was to land undetected, which would give Steve a head start. After that, it was up to him. A few hours after landing, Captain America raced his motorcycle through the dense forest near the Hydra base. His team was behind him, getting ready for their part, and Steve was running on pure adrenaline. He was finally going to take the Red Skull down and make the evil man pay for all the death and destruction he had been responsible for. Whatever happened today, Captain America had only one goal: to face the Red Skull alone. He was so focused on Schmidt that he didn't notice when his bike unwittingly tripped a wire lying across the small road. Nearby, in a secret Hydra outpost, a warning light blinked. Seeing it, 2 Hydra guards leaped onto their bikes and headed toward the road. Soon, they had caught up to Steve. The sound of roaring engines caused Cap to turn as the Hydra troopers drove onto the road. They were just a few feet behind him and gaining fast. Revving his engine, Captain America shot forward, but the sentries were too close. They gained on him. Before he could maneuver away, one of them jerked his handlebars to the left, sideswiping Cap's bike. The motorcycle wobbled, but Steve managed to steady it. Then he quickly jerked his wheel to the right, causing him to careen into the trooper. There was the sound of metal crunching as the bike frames crashed into each other. Captain America needed to get rid of this trooper. Looking up ahead, he smiled. It seemed he'd just found a way. Gunning his engine, he hunched low over the handlebars and sped forward, the trooper staying right behind him. Then, at the last moment, Cap dropped his bike into a slide, ducking below a low-hanging branch. The trooper didn't have time to react, and whack! He hit the branch head-on. The Hydra agent went flying, his bike exploding in the fiery crash. There was no time to celebrate taking down the guard. Gunshots rang out as the other trooper pulled his pistol and began firing. Cap ducked and wove his bike down the road, trying to stay out of the way of the flying bullets. But he couldn't keep it up forever. Thinking quickly, he slammed on his brakes, the tires screeching on the pavement. In moments, the trooper caught up with him. When he did, Cap grabbed the handlebars of the other bike. Using all his super strength, he clung tightly as the trooper swerved back and forth across the road. Steve stuck like glue. Seeing a huge pine tree ahead, Steve jerked the sentry's bike toward it. Just before they were about to crash, Steve turned at the last possible second, saving himself from certain death. But the Hydra agent couldn't get away. His bike slammed into the pine and exploded. Steve smiled. 2 down. A few more to go. It was time to get inside the Hydra base. The Hydra base was built into the side of a mountain in the Alps, its outside buildings protected by a large wall topped with barbed wire. Alarms were already sounding as Captain America approached. But he didn't care. This was all part of his plan. The plan he hadn't told Peggy or Phillips about. But he did tell the Howling Commandos about it, and hopefully they were at the ready. When he was about 20 feet away from the wall, Cap gunned his bike's engine. A few feet later, he pulled back on the handlebars. As the engine groaned under the effort, he jumped the bike up and over the wall. He landed with a thud safely on the other side. Hydra troopers immediately opened fire as Steve tore across the compound. With lightning-quick reflexes, he stayed ahead of the bullets and laid the bike down in an expert slide, leaping free to join the fray. He fought off as many Hydra troopers as he could, but there were just too many of them. They surrounded him, energy weapons leveled. Captain America had been captured. A few minutes later, Captain America found himself inside Johann Schmidt's office. It was dark and oppressive. On one wall, a large picture of Schmidt, with his red skull showing in all its hideous glory, was displayed. Steve didn't know whether it was supposed to serve as a warning to those who entered, or whether Schmidt was so crazy he just liked to look at his disfigured face. The red skull circled him, with a sneer. "Arrogance may not be a uniquely American trait," he said, "but I must say you do it better than anyone. Still, there are limits to what even you can do, Captain, or did Erskine tell you otherwise?" "He told me you were insane," Steve said. "Ah," Schmidt said. "He resented my genius and tried to deny me what was rightfully mine, but he gave you everything. So, what made you so special?" "Nothing," Steve said. "I'm just a kid from Brooklyn." The red skull hit him, and he went down. Struggling, he turned and tried to kick Schmidt, but Steve was in an awkward position and the kick went wide. Grabbing Cap's foot, the Hydra leader swung Captain America into a wall, instantly knocking the wind out of him. But Captain America wasn't ready to give up yet. "I can do this all day," Steve said, breathing heavily. Just like he'd said to the bully back in the Brooklyn alley. He had strength and power now, but he had always had will and determination. That was more important. That's what Dr. Erskine had meant when, with his dying breath, he had tapped on Steve's chest. Heart mattered the most. "I believe you can," the Red Skull replied. He pulled out his pistol and aimed it at Steve's head, his hand steady. "But I'm on a tight schedule." Captain America didn't look scared or upset. In fact, he looked happy. "So am I," he said, just as the office window behind him shattered. Falsworth and the rest of the Howling Commandos crashed into the room, swinging from ropes and firing their weapons. Using the distraction to his advantage, Captain America rose to his feet and barreled into the Red Skull. The Hydra leader went flying into the far wall, leaving a human-sized dent in it. Meanwhile, explosions rocked the base above. Rage filled Schmidt's red face, turning it even redder. Reaching out, he gave Captain America a 1-2 punch that sent him flying backward. As Cap tried to recover, Schmidt raced across the room and grabbed a titanium box. It was the same one that Steve had seen back when he had rescued Bucky. Whatever was inside must be important to Schmidt, he thought. Steve planned on taking it from the Hydra leader before destroying him. As Steve watched, Schmidt bolted from the room. The rest of Steve's team had taken care of the Hydra troopers who had tried to fight them and were now cleaning up the mess. Steve picked up his shield and made sure the area was secure, but he had to go after Schmidt. At the same moment, more guards entered and fired their weapons. All of them shouted, "Hail Hydra!" One went on, "Cut off one head, 2 more shall rise!" Just then, a blam finished the trooper's sentence as he fell to the ground. Colonel Phillips strode through the base, machine gun in hand, and addressed the Howling Commandos. "Then let's go find 2 more, he said. Confident that the colonel and the Howling Commandos could handle the rest of the Hydra troopers, Steve turned and raced down the corridor. Captain America was going after the Red Skull. Chapter 14. The underground base was full of corridors that twisted and turned, making it easy to get lost. Turning a corner, Captain America saw the Red Skull up ahead, the box still clutched tightly in his hand. He put on a burst of speed. Hearing footsteps, the Red Skull turned and pulled out a gun. It looked a lot like the one Steve had seen on the train. As he watched, it filled with blue energy and the blast came straight at him. Quickly, Cap raised his vibranium shield, and the blue energy splashed against it in a brilliant flash of light. Amazing, Steve thought. He'd seen men completely disintegrated by those weapons, and their impact on the shield wasn't any harder than a raindrop. He'd lost a step on Schmidt, though, and when Steve started running again, Schmidt was already around a bend in the corridor. Steve heard the unmistakable grinding of a heavy mechanical blast door starting to close. There was no way Captain America was going to let the Red Skull get away, not when he was this close to taking down the Hydra leader. Pulling his arm back, he flung the shield so it glanced off the wall. With any luck, he'd nail Schmidt on his way through the door. Thunk! That was not the sound of the shield hitting a Hydra super soldier. More like the sound a shield might make when it jammed itself into the narrowing gap between two sides of a heavy blast door. Standing up on the other side, Steve looked around. There was nowhere to go but straight ahead. He quickly began running down the corridor, only to come to a screeching halt. Standing in front of him, holding two weapons that looked like huge flamethrowers, stood a Hydra trooper. The trooper had a tank filled to the top with the powerful and deadly blue substance strapped to his back. Steve gulped. This wasn't good. Raising the twin guns, the trooper pulled a trigger. On his back, the tank gurgled and whined as it sent fiery blue energy through the tubes and into the guns. Cap lifted his hand reflexively, thinking his shield was still on his forearm. But then he remembered. It was jammed in the blast door around the bend ahead, thanks to his long-range shot at the Red Skull. He was completely defenseless. Steve pressed himself into a nearby recessed doorway as the trooper blasted the hall with a flaming geyser. Cap held his spot, feeling enough heat that he was surprised he didn't just go up like a Roman candle. He had a feeling super strength wasn't going to make him fireproof. The flame winked out. If the Hydra trooper's weapon was like most flamethrowers, he had to interrupt the fire every so often, or its barrels would melt. Steve glanced out into the hall. Everything that wasn't metal was on fire. Seeing Steve, the trooper fired up the flamethrowers again. Uh-oh, Steve thought. He started to duck back into the doorway again, hoping he could time a jump out to disable the Hydra trooper the next time he let the flames go out. As he moved, he heard a sharp burst of gunfire. He hit the ground as the Hydra trooper's canister went up in a blue flare, and he went down face first onto the scorched steel floor. When the smoke from the blast cleared, there was Peggy Carter coming out of a side corridor. "You're late," Steve said, smiling at her. He had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. Peggy smiled back at him, her eyes warm. With a wave of thanks, Captain America took off after the Red Skull. When he got to the blast door, he ducked under his shield and then jerked it out of the gap. The door finished grinding its way closed. Steve spun around, not knowing what to expect. He found himself inside a giant hangar built deep into the mountain. A rumbling filled the air. As Steve watched, a gigantic plane rolled past. But this was no normal plane. It was a design he'd never seen before. A flying wing, basically, like a giant steel arrowhead, at least 4 times the size of the biggest U.S. Army plane. It had 4 giant turbo propeller engines and it bristled with gun turrets. Looking around, Steve noticed that there were 5 more just like it. These must be the planes that Schmidt was going to use to attack the United States. They're big enough to carry the blue bombs and thousands of Hydra troopers, he realized. Looking back at the plane that was making its way down the hangar, Steve saw Schmidt sitting in the cockpit. The Hydra leader turned and smiled. Steve couldn't stop him now. The plane began moving faster and faster. At the other end of the hangar, giant doors began to open, letting in the glare of sunlight. This wasn't just a hangar. It was a runway. Captain America started sprinting, but it was no use. The Red Skull was too far ahead. Steve was fast, but not as fast as a giant plane. His fists pumped at his sides as he tried harder and harder to pick up speed. He was just about to give up when the sound of a car engine came from right next to him. Looking over, Steve saw Colonel Phillips sitting behind the wheel of Schmidt's custom Hydra Roadster. Peggy was in the back seat. Quickly, Steve leaped into the car as Phillips stepped on the gas, sending them shooting forward. In moments, they had caught up with the plane. The car shuddered as Phillips pulled it up next to the plane's large back tire. The wheel was attached to long metal landing gear that extended up to the inside of the plane itself. Captain America stood. He was glad the car was a convertible. It would have been harder to get onto the landing gear through the window. He was about to make the jump when Peggy let out a shout. "Wait!" she cried. Then, before Steve knew what was happening, she pulled him into a kiss. For a moment, Steve forgot about Schmidt. He forgot about Hydra and the pending attack. For once in his life, Steve Rogers got the girl. Reluctantly, he pulled away. He had to go. Hopefully, he'd return from this mission and ask Peggy to a dance. "Go get him!" Colonel Phillips shouted over the sound of the plane's engines. "I'm not kissing you." Steve cracked a smile. After one last look at Peggy, he turned and jumped onto the wheel, just as the plane burst out of the tunnel. Behind him, Steve saw Phillips slam on the brakes and drag the car into a sideways drift. He breathed a sigh of relief when the car stopped just on the edge of a long drop down the mountain. They were okay. Steve's own situation was a little more tricky. The jet was flying over a huge gorge, and Steve was losing his grip. If he fell now, there was no way he would survive. Just then, the plane's landing gear groaned and slowly started to retract. He let out a huge breath. That had been way too close for comfort. Steve's relief was short-lived. As he let go of the landing gear, he found himself looking at a huge flight deck within the belly of the giant plane. 8 fighter jets were armed and ready, their noses aimed toward the back hatch of the plane. He'd been right. This was one of the planes that were going to attack the United States, and there were 5 more back inside the hangar, unless Phillips and the team had managed to stop them from taking off. Captain America had to find the Red Skull. Now. Unfortunately, that was going to be a bit difficult. As he watched, the 8 pilots who belonged to those fighter jets ran down from the bridge above. All of them had guns trained on Cap. Right as the first 2 troopers reached him, Captain America whipped around and slammed them both with a flying spin kick. They fell to the ground, unconscious. Another one came at him, and Cap simply picked him up and threw him across the deck. He hit the far wall with a thud. The 4th trooper got smashed in the face by Captain America's shield. Steve was holding his own, and then a huge pilot surprised him with a right hook. The punch sent Steve staggering backward onto one of the fighter jets. Inside, another pilot was sitting in the cockpit. He flicked a few switches and the jet burst to life. Another flick of the switch opened up the hatch, and before Steve could do anything, the pilot shot the plane forward, right into the open sky. As the air whistled around him, Steve clung to the jet's hood. Slowly, he crept forward, making his way toward the cockpit. But the pilot wasn't about to let that happen. He executed a series of barrel rolls. Steve's legs flew out behind him as he struggled to hold on. Then, the pilot pushed down the throttle, and the plane nosedived. Still, Steve hung on. When the plane righted itself, Steve pulled himself forward another few inches. He was within reach of the cockpit. But to get to the pilot, he'd have to punch out the glass. And that meant letting go with one hand. Steve took a deep breath. Before the pilot could make another move, he reached back his hand and then, smash! He shattered the cockpit's glass, sending shards flying into the air. With one last pull, he made his way over the glass and, reaching down, released the ejector seat. Letting out a cry, the pilot was launched high into the sky. With no one to steer it, the plane began to dive again. Climbing over the window, Captain America got into the cockpit and quickly pulled back on the throttle. When the plane was stabilized, he turned it around and flew back up, toward the Red Skull's giant plane of death, the Valkyrie. During Steve's battle with the fighter jet, the Red Skull had flown the huge plane far ahead. Pressing the throttle forward as far as it could go, Steve raced after it. Blue bursts of energy fired at him from bubble turrets on top of the Valkyrie, but Captain America dodged them. He was closing in. When he was right at the hatch, he let up on the lever and the jet flew into the bigger plane's flight deck, landing with a flash of sparks and a shriek of brakes. Finally, it came to a stop. He had made it. Still, the fight wasn't over. Up in the cockpit, the Red Skull was steering the plane closer and closer to the United States. And if Captain America didn't stop him, he would destroy everything and everyone Cap had been fighting for. The American super soldier was battered and bruised and shaky, but he crawled out of the plane and stood up, his head held high against the evil Red Skull. Steve had no way of knowing what was happening back at the Hydra base. He could only hope that his team, along with Peggy and Phillips, were in control and alive. He wished that he could talk to them, find out what was going on, and tell them that it would all be okay. But he couldn't. Not yet. Right now he was going to get into that cockpit, and then he was going to take Schmidt down. He would figure out what was in that box Schmidt held so dear and destroy it. And then he would take the plane and all the bombs it carried and destroy it too. A year ago, Steve Rogers was just an ordinary guy hoping to join the Army. Now he was the courageous Captain America. People had given their lives to get him here, and he wouldn't let them down. Whatever the future held, he knew that he had to succeed. For Peggy and Bucky, for Erskine and Phillips, for the Howling Commandos, and most of all, for his country. With heart, strength, and grim determination, Steve Rogers set off in the direction of the cockpit. It was time for the final confrontation. It was time for him to stop Johann Schmidt once and for all, no matter what the cost. It was time for the Red Skull and all of Hydra to learn that evil would never prevail over justice. Not while Captain America was still around to stop them. Chapter 15. He found his way to the Valkyrie's flight deck. There was a single pilot's chair surrounded by a half-circle of instrument consoles. In the middle of the consoles was a two-handed steering yoke. Through the windows, Steve saw only open sky. Behind the pilot's chair stood a machine. Steve took a moment to look at it. It was about 4 feet tall, with heavy cables coming out from it down to the floor. There was some kind of tank or chamber at the front of it, with a locking lid. Blue light blazed inside it. Behind that was a sloping case filled with cables and hoses. The blue glow was bright there, too, as if some kind of energy was pumping out from this machine into the rest of the plane. Maybe it powered the whole thing. Steve thought about wrecking it. That would crash the plane and save how many lives? But he still didn't know where the Red Skull was, and Steve wanted to face him first. Just as he thought that, he heard a sound from the back of the flight deck where he had come in. He spun and brought his shield up just in time to absorb the blast of a Hydra energy rifle. There was the Red Skull. Steve charged him, feeling 2 more energy blasts hit his shield. A third missed him and shattered one of the cockpit windows. Wind began to howl through the flight deck. He hit the Red Skull with everything he had, using the shield like a battering ram. Schmidt reeled backward and tried to raise the rifle again. Steve smashed it with his shield. A blast of blue energy flashed out from it, blinding him. It set off sparks from other electrical equipment in the cockpit. The Red Skull dropped the rifle and caught the shield as Steve swung it at him. He tore it from Steve's hands and smashed Steve across the face with it. Steve stumbled. He blocked Schmidt's next punch, and they fought over the shield. Steve got control of it and threw Schmidt away from him. He banged into the instrument console and knocked the steering yoke hard to one side. Both Steve and Schmidt flew into the air as the Valkyrie dove suddenly almost straight down. It was like there was no gravity. Steve was flung toward the back of the flight deck again, bouncing along the ceiling. The Red Skull fought the G-force of the plane's dive and reached out for a button on the instrument console. Steve couldn't get there in time to stop him. He hit the button. The Valkyrie pulled out of its dive and leveled off, throwing both of them hard to the floor. The Red Skull got to his feet first. He pulled a pistol from a holster at his belt. It looked just like a German Army Luger, but Steve could see the telltale glow of blue in its barrel. It was a Hydra energy pistol. He got the shield up and rolled away just in time as Schmidt fired several shots. They punched holes straight through the steel floor of the flight deck. "You don't give up, do you?" the Red Skull called out. Steve faced him, crouching and ready for the Luger to fire again. "Nope," he said. "You could have the power of the gods, yet you wear a flag on your chest and think you fight a battle of nations." Again, Steve dodged as the Red Skull fired at him. "I have seen the future, Captain. There are no flags." Steve had ducked behind a bulkhead at the back of the flight deck, near the door. Now he stepped out, shield ready. "Not my future," he said, and threw the shield as hard as he could. The Red Skull tried to block the shield, but Steve had thrown it too hard. It knocked the Red Skull flat and then deflected off the wall and into the glowing blue machine behind the pilot's chair. There was an explosion that knocked them both over. Steve scrambled to pick up the shield as blue energy crackled and spat from the wreckage of the machine. Now he could see what was inside it. There was a cylinder holding a glowing blue cube. That was the energy source. Exposed to the open air, it was firing off strange waves of light. The air felt strange, like everything was being bent or stretched somehow. Steve looked up and couldn't believe what he saw. The roof of the Valkyrie wasn't there anymore. He was looking at deep space. He saw clusters of stars, brightly colored nebulas, even entire galaxies. How could that be? It was broad daylight outside. "What have you done?" screamed the Red Skull. He pulled himself to his feet next to the broken cylinder and touched the cube. Sparks and lines of energy ran up and down his fingers. He picked the cube up and held it in the palm of his hand. That's when things started to get really crazy. The Red Skull stared at the cube in his hand. Steve was about to go after him again, but his eyes widened and he stayed where he was when he saw what was happening. "No!" Schmidt howled. The light from the cube washed through his hand, and he started to disintegrate, bit by bit. He turned into streaks of light that beamed away, up into the endless space where the Valkyrie's ceiling had been. Steve was amazed. It didn't look like Schmidt was in pain. He was just astonished, watching himself turn into a multicolored spray of energy. Then, he was gone. The portal closed and the view into deep space disappeared. The cube fell to the metal grating on the floor around the broken machine. It melted through the grating with a soft crackle, then it melted through the floor below that and tumbled away out of sight. Steve was alone in the plane, somewhere over the far North Atlantic, maybe even over the Arctic by now. The Valkyrie was a very fast aircraft. He had to get control of it somehow, if he could. And if he couldn't, no matter what else happened, he had to make sure those flying bombs in the Valkyrie's belly did not reach their targets. He got into the pilot's chair and set his shield down. The steering yoke was jammed. He couldn't move the plane off its autopilot-installed bearing. There were a couple of map displays on the instrument console. One showed his current location, somewhere in the Arctic, barreling over pack ice towards North America. The other display showed a map of the area around New York City with the German caption, Ziel. That was German for target. He turned on the Valkyrie's radio and found the SSR frequency. "Come in," he said. "Come in, this is Captain Rogers. Can you hear me?" When they heard Captain America's voice over the SSR control room speakers, everyone froze. Morita was the first to respond. He toggled the radio microphone and answered, "Captain Rogers, what is your position?" Before Captain America could answer, Peggy leaned in and took the microphone away from him.
"Steve, is that you? Are you all right?"
"Great," he said. "Schmidt's dead." There was a crackle of static as he spoke. Even so, everyone in the control room heard him. There were a few cheers, but not a big racket. They weren't out of the woods yet. Peggy leaned in to find out more.
"What about the plane?"
"That's a little bit tougher to explain," Captain America said after a moment.
"Give me your coordinates," Peggy said. "We'll find you a safe landing site."
She looked over at the big map on the wall. The standard flight path from the Hydra base in the Alps to New York would have taken it over Great Britain and Ireland. Schmidt had probably gone farther north to avoid the potential for aerial combat. So, if the plane had gone farther north, say crossing over Iceland and Greenland, then coming back south over the remote Canadian Arctic. There were bases. Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Maine in the United States. There was a way to handle the problem. On the Valkyrie, Steve thought about this. He wrestled with the controls and started to understand that the plane was too damaged to trust. The steering yoke barely moved to the right and left, but it did seem to go up and down. He leaned into the mic to make sure Peggy could hear him over the howl of the wind through the broken cockpit window. "This thing's moving too fast and it's headed for New York," he said. "I gotta put it in the water." Peggy's voice crackled back at him immediately.
"Please, don't do this. We have time."
Steve looked at the map display on the instrument console. He saw lots of ice and water. Glaciers, fjords. No cities, no towns. He figured Peggy was looking at a map too, but she didn't know how badly the Valkyrie was damaged, and he didn't have time to explain it to her. At his current airspeed, he was going to be within range of big cities in just a couple of minutes. "Right now I'm in the middle of nowhere. If I wait any longer, a lot of people are going to die," he said. "Peggy, it's my choice." It was the only choice. He opened up his compass and put it on the altimeter readout so he could look at the picture of her. Then he braced both hands on the steering yoke and pushed it forward as far as it would go. The Valkyrie dove, gathering speed. The altimeter needle spun backward faster and faster. The Valkyrie was dropping thousands of feet every second.
It's 1804.
Thousands of feet every second. Out the windows, Steve saw ice and water, still far away, but getting closer fast. "Peggy?" he said. In the SSR control room, there was dead silence. Peggy swallowed and said,
"I'm here."
"I'm gonna need a rain check on that dance." She smiled a little.
"All right,"
she said.
"A week, next Saturday, at the Stork Club, 8 o'clock on the dot."
She paused to gather herself and added,
"Don't you dare be late. Understood?"
There was a crackle over the speakers, then Captain America's voice again. "You know, I still don't know how to dance."
"I'll show you how,"
Peggy said.
"Just be there."
"We'll have the band play something slow," Captain America said. "I'd hate to step on your—" Static. Steve woke up to the sound of the Dodgers on the radio. He sat up and looked around. He was in a room, maybe a hospital room? It was sunny, with a spring breeze coming in through an open window. He was wearing an SSR t-shirt, khakis, and boots. Why boots? He didn't remember putting them on. The last thing he remembered was putting the Valkyrie into a steep dive. He'd heard Peggy's voice over the radio and kept his eyes on her picture. Then, nothing. On the radio, Red Barber's voice got more excited as Pete Reiser cracked a line drive all the way to the wall. "Rizzo will score. Reiser heads to third. DeRocher is going to wave him in. They look to relay, but they hold steady. Pete Reiser with an inside-the-park home run." But something wasn't right. He was groggy, but he could tell. Where was his shield? Where was his uniform? A woman came into the room. Steve swung his legs over the side of the bed, still doing a mental check on himself. He seemed to be all right. He seemed to be great, in fact. It was pretty surprising. Erskine's super soldier stuff was even better than Steve had thought. It had let him survive the crash of the Valkyrie.
"Good morning," the woman said. "Or should I say afternoon?"
Steve didn't know how to answer that. "Where am I?"
"You're in a recovery room in New York City,"
she said. On the radio, Red gave the score. "Dodgers take the lead. It's 8-4. He looked at her. She looked a little like Peggy. Steve remembered he had a date. Stork Club, 8 o'clock sharp. What day was it? He hoped it wasn't Saturday yet. While he was thinking about that, something about the radio broadcast clicked. An Inside the Park Grand Slam? Steve remembered sitting in the grandstand at Ebbets Field as Pete Reiser headed around third for home. Alarm bells started to go off in Steve's mind. This room was not what it seemed. "Where am I really?" Steve asked.
"I'm afraid I don't understand,"
she said. "The game," Steve said. He nodded toward the radio. "It's from May 1941. I know, because I was there." He stood up and faced her. Something was wrong here, and he needed to know what it was. "Now I'm going to ask you again."
"Captain Rogers."
Steve noticed she was holding something in her hand and pressing a button on it. "Who are you?" Steve demanded. She kept pressing the button as Steve started looking for a way out. The doors behind her burst open and soldiers came in. They weren't wearing any uniform Steve recognized. They might not be Nazis, but they sure weren't U.S. Army either. He charged them and knocked them straight through the wall. It came apart more easily than it should have. Steve charged through after them. The room was a fake. It was built in the middle of a big, dark space like a warehouse. The light was strange, cold, and blue. Steve looked right and left. He spotted a sign over one of the doors. Exit. He ran toward it and collided with another guard. Steve threw him out of the way. The guard hit the wall and went down. Steve ran on. A loudspeaker sounded an alarm. "All agents, code 13, code 13. Steve shoved 2 more guards aside. He could see another large open room ahead. There was daylight there. When he ran into that room, he saw a row of glass doors. There were security guards charging toward him. Should he stay and fight, or get outside? Instinct told him to go. He didn't have his shield and didn't know where he was. The sooner he got away from the people chasing him, the sooner he could figure out what was going on. Steve sprinted for the door and got outside. He knew right away he was in a city. Lots of cars, tall buildings, honking horns. A split second later, he knew he was in New York when he saw street signs at the nearest corner. He was on 45th Street near Broadway. Okay, he thought. He would head for the antiques store in Brooklyn where Dr. Erskine's lab was hidden. Peggy and Colonel Phillips would be there. Steve ran to the corner and turned down Broadway. He was so focused on getting away from the fake room and finding Peggy that at first he didn't notice how different everything was. Bit by bit, it dawned on him, though. After a few seconds, it overwhelmed him. He stopped in the middle of Times Square, stunned. This was not the Times Square he remembered. There had always been billboards, throngs of tourists, people selling things from sidewalk tables. But not like this. The buildings were taller and made of shining glass. The billboards were like giant view screens, the kind of advanced gear only Hydra or the SSR had, the kind of thing Howard Stark would dream up. Pictures and words crawled across them, giant ads 10 stories tall. He spun around as something else hit him. The cars. These weren't the sleek sedans and coupes Steve remembered. They were all different shapes and sizes, all different colors. Their engines sounded different. They looked like spaceships from a movie almost. Some of them reminded Steve of the concept flying car Howard Stark had shown at the expo. That seemed like a long time ago. Crashing a giant airplane into the Arctic and then waking up in New York did strange things to your head, Steve thought. How long had he been out? Big black cars, like paddy wagons, squealed to a halt all around him, blocking traffic. Soldiers got out wearing black uniforms Steve didn't recognize. They had eagles on their patches. From the nearest car, a bald black man with an eye patch approached Steve. He wasn't dressed like an officer, but he carried himself like one. "At ease, soldier," he said. Steve just looked at him. There was no way to know where he was in the chain of command. Did Steve have to salute him? Was he real? What did he know about all this? "Look, I'm sorry about that little show back there," he said. "But we thought it best to break it to you slowly." "Break what?" Steve asked. "You've been asleep, Cap," the officer said. Steve saw sympathy on his face. "For almost 70 years. 70 years? He remembered the fight with Schmidt on the Valkyrie like it had happened just a few hours ago. The date of that operation was May 4th, 1945. So now, if it was almost 70 years later, this was... He looked again at the screens on the buildings surrounding Times Square. The date and time scrolled across the bottom of one, below some kind of news report. It was April 17th, 2012. 2012. Peggy would be an old, old woman now, if she was still alive. Steve sure hadn't made it to the Stork Club on time. I crashed Hydra's superweapon and saved New York, Steve thought. Then I woke up in the future. "You going to be okay?" the officer asked. Steve thought he didn't have much choice. He had to be okay. Here he was. He was a soldier. "Yeah," he said. I had a date."